Hi, my name is Dr. Rayshawn Ray, aiming to speak truth to power. This is my daily thought. I watched one of Tommy Sotomayor's monologues about black violence and how it is used to justify that all black people then have the right to be criminalized because of some black people who live in predominantly black, segregated, poor, and under-resourced neighborhoods. There are several problems and fatal flaws that's wrong with this video and videos like it that I actually want to share and correct. First, one problem is that people like him paint all black people with a broad brush. An overwhelming percentage of black people have never committed a violent crime. So to make comments as if blacks are a homogenous group is highly problematic. Second, black women actually have the highest percentage of college completion of any race gender group in the United States. Yet, black college graduates are least likely to obtain jobs requiring a college degree. This is called discrimination. A recent study out of Harvard showed that despite blacks being rated higher on communication, higher on case analysis ability, and higher on math, they were less likely to be considered a cultural fit and thus less likely to get a job. Third, crime in places like the South Side of Chicago is about racial segregation and poverty. Police brutality on blacks occurs in all neighborhoods, not just these. Fourth, 86% of all whites who are murdered by other whites. Similarly, 94% of blacks are murdered by other blacks. Crime is mostly intraracial, meaning among individuals in the same racial group because of our neighborhoods that are so segregated by race regardless of social class. So for people who really understand racial inequality, we know that if we really want to deal with crime in places like the South Side of Chicago, we must address racial segregation and poverty. And see, the South Side of Chicago is key. I hear people say Chicago, right? We're really talking about a specific area, South Side of Chicago, because crime isn't high right now in the street in Hyde Park, though black men are criminalized and policed there who have no affiliation with the South Side. You can see Brent Staples' classic piece on whistling classical music songs to try to make people feel more comfortable with his presence as he went to the University of Chicago. So to deal with police brutality, we must reconstruct our policies about use of force and weed out quote-unquote bad apples who may be overrepresented among their use of force. Thus, we need good cops to speak up against these bad apples. However, another key part is very, very important. In addition to that, we need policy changes. We need changes in the policies that allow for people to overly police others and criminalize other people. He also mentions sagging pants and tattoos. See, the problem with that analogy is that black men in suits get criminalized, and that's the more important issue here. So this narrative that black people don't care about crime in black neighborhoods or don't also vilify violent acts committed against blacks is simply ludicrous. You don't hear anyone aggrieved that the person who did a drive-by was arrested or killed. We are aggrieved about the Jordan Davises, about the Tamir Rices, about the Jonathan Farrells. We are aggrieved about the unarmed ones. We are aggrieved at the ones who are pulled over because they had a quote-unquote wide nose like Philando Castile and end up dead. We are aggrieved about the ones choked to death or shot to death for selling loose cigarettes and CDs outside of a store and telling you that they can't breathe, and yet they still keep getting choked. We are aggrieved because due to racial preferences to whites are oftentimes de-escalated when it comes to these police interactions on a daily basis, while blacks end up seeing the end of a bullet as their last memory. The other important underlying part of this is that blacks like Tommy Sotomayor must distinguish their own mental and emotional health as it relates to the treatment of black men like the ones he shows and of himself. In other words, he has to actually psychologically try to separate the experiences of other black men from those of himself. If he doesn't, then everything he supposedly worked hard for is obsolete. It means very little. If people like him have to admit that their social class and politics of respectability of dressing the part and talking the part don't matter, then he must also admit that there's little he can do to actually change racism in part of his life experiences. Most people don't want to admit that because they can't. It will then be too detrimental for them psychologically and emotionally. So they exhibit what social psychologists, what people like myself call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you are told facts about an issue and a reason about a particular outcome, But your mind works so hard to keep that original position in alignment so that you will not experience a loss of psychological centrality and reflected appraisals. Moreover, when people admit that there is something out of their control, then they realize their locus of control is not as high as they thought. This realization is detrimental psychologically and emotionally. The other main issue is that Tommy Sotomayor isn't representative of blacks. There's a group of blacks who embrace his perspective, but the question is why? I explained cognitive dissonance, and I think this is the primary reason, and it still comes back to how blacks are treated more broadly. They want equality just like everyone else. They just don't know how else to pursue it because they only see things on an individual level. They actually can't see how racism operates on an institutional level. And this applies to most people in the general population, not just this group. Next, black people actually do march and protest against violence in black communities. Whether mainstream media are there to actually capture these protests and marches are another thing. So if you've never gone to these neighborhoods, to people's homes, to community centers, to churches, to barbershops, to hair salons, where people are discussing these issues on a regular basis, then you would never know the depth to which people think and talk about these issues in black communities. Next, crime in black communities shouldn't be my responsibility or our responsibility as blacks to deal with alone, no more than it should be white people's responsibility to deal with white crime alone. Crime is crime. The problem is that due to institutional racism, we live in neighborhoods that are more segregated today than they were in 1980. So neighborhoods are actually more racially segregated today than they were 36 years ago. These neighborhoods, these highly segregated, poor, predominantly black neighborhoods, have been dilapidated with horrible schools and no jobs. And if we want to solve crime, then we must solve racial segregation. We must solve poverty. But see, people don't really want to solve crime because they don't really want to address the root causes of the problem, which are racial segregation and poverty. Despite this, simply because some other black person commits crime, I should not be treated unfairly by the police or in any other public spaces for that matter because of the color of my skin. In fact, blacks with a bachelor's degree and professional jobs are more likely to report personal and institutional forms of discrimination. I know this from the research that I've been conducting over a decade on upwardly mobile African Americans. And in this regard, this is what Black Lives Matter is primarily about. Police brutality won't go away if crime stops in black neighborhoods. Black people who live in predominantly white neighborhoods get criminalized and policed all the time. Take Harvard professor Dr. Henry Louis Gates. You can look up the information of his incident that happened in Cambridge. So Black Lives Matter organizations and chapters are mostly operated by black young adults who have bachelor's degrees or are obtaining them currently. The previous generation, my generation, generations before me, we told millennials, if you go to school and get a good education, if you get a good job, you will be treated equal. Black young adults are seeing that this narrative about how to get equality is a lie. Young adults are seeing that this is far from their reality. That's one of the fundamental things that they are protesting about. But see, people like Tommy Sotomayor can't tell them apart from quote-unquote thugs. As he says, some snakes are poisonous and some snakes aren't, and he doesn't want to find out which is which. You know, the irony is that the Tommy Sotomayors of the world must have not looked in the mirror lately, because by making that statement, he is inherently calling himself a snake. Wow. And then the monkey picture of Obama. I mean, I could just shake my head at that. That level of self-hate is so deep, sad, and tragic. So to the Tommy Sotomayors of the world, get more nuanced with your understanding of race and racism. But then again, maybe you actually don't want to, because you're making money off of spreading false narratives about black people. But more importantly, because if you actually do get more nuanced about your understanding of racism, you have to admit something inherent about you that you can't actually do something about. How people perceive you based on the color of your skin. Regardless of whether or not you don't sag, don't show any tattoos, or have a PhD like me. Bottom line, if you're going to tell the story, get the story right. Thanks for listening. Remember that conversations matter like Black lives and books. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Sociologist Ray. And you can also sign up for a weekly update on my website at rayshonray.com. Thanks for tuning in.